Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on our Interagency Stakeholder webinar on climate and wildfire investments in Governor's California Comeback Plan. I'd like to turn it over to Matt Almy.
Thank you, Andrea. Good afternoon. My name is Matt Almy with the Department of... Over the last 2 years, the administration has developed bold strategies to accelerate the state's transition to a resilient, equitable, carbon neutral future. These strategies have included reducing catastrophic wildfire risks through the acceleration of fire prevention projects that protect communities and enhance forest health, consistent with the Forest Management Task Force Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan, as well as developing a water resilience portfolio, which outlines a comprehensive strategy to enable California's water systems to adjust to increasing temperatures, shrinking snowpack, rising sea levels, and more intense and frequent periods of drought, as well as transforming California's transportation system to aggressively transition to zero-emission vehicles. The combination of significantly higher state revenues and additional has provided an historic opportunity to invest in the administration's climate initiatives. Specifically, the May revision proposes over $11 billion to enhance the state's climate resilience and reduce carbon emissions. Significant highlights of these investments include $5.1 billion over multiple years for water projects that will provide immediate drought relief, provide access to safe drinking water, build water supply reliability, action. $3.2 billion over multiple years to accelerate the state's zero-emission vehicle goals, and an additional $708 million for fire prevention and forest health projects to protect wildfire vulnerable communities and increase the pace and scale of forest management projects, which build on the $536 million adopted in early action for total investment of $1.2 billion for forest health. Several agency secretaries are here to provide further details on these issues, as well as other May revision initiatives. I would now like to turn it over to Kate Gordon.
Thanks so much, Matt, and thank you everybody for being on the call. It's an amazing group of people, so sure there's lots of friends out there. I'm Kate Gordon. I am the Governor's Senior Policy Advisor on Climate, as well as the Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and the Chair of the Strategic Growth Council. And I say all those titles because they're all relevant to this very integrated package in this budget, which has an enormous amount to be excited about. To provide more details and demonstrate the truly cross-cutting nature of the California Comeback Plan when it comes to climate, we'll hear from the following leaders. Of course, Secretary Wade Crowfoot from Natural Resources Agency to provide an overview of investments in wildfire risk reduction and natural resource management and conservation. Secretary Jared Blumenfeld from the Environmental Protection Agency to detail the historic investments proposed for environmental justice and our transition to a cleaner future through toxic site cleanup, new recycling technology, and a zero-emission transportation sector. And Secretary Karen Ross, Secretary of Agriculture, to speak to the commitment to climate smart agriculture that you'll see throughout this proposal. Before jumping into the details of each of those agency proposals, I want to outline some foundational investments that will support every one of those pieces, as well as, frankly, the entire California Comeback Plan. Not only this climate-focused section we're talking about today, but really every area of government, because these pieces emphasize decision-making based on sound science and community engagement. You'll see that running as a theme through this whole budget. We look forward to working with all of you, stakeholders, and of course the legislature to move this entire integrated, equitable, and regions up climate budget forward. And there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the call. So let me jump in real quick on some of those foundational kind of supports to the rest of the budget. Starting with, the fact that if we can't measure climate impacts, we can't manage them. And I'm really thrilled to say that this California Comeback Plan includes $22 million over 5 years to the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Natural Resources Agency, the Energy Commission, and the Strategic Growth Council to implement the 5th California Climate Change Assessment, which of course was put into statute through SB 1320 last year. The fifth assessment will focus on turning science to action by looking at climate impacts by region and sector, and doubling down on the legislature's priorities of protecting public health and safety, reducing risk to vulnerable communities, and building economic stability in the face of climate change. And that'll be done through a very robust stakeholder engagement process. So I guarantee all of you will hear more about this, including providing data at a very granular scale necessary to be actionable, addressing California's specific research needs and questions that aren't always addressed by the National Climate Assessment, like the focus on specialty agriculture, not just commodity agriculture, for instance, and a first of its kind tribal climate research program. In the vein of actionable climate science, we also see in this budget $5 million to the Office of Planning and Research to fund expanded implementation of the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, or ICARP, by investing in tools that translate complex climate science into action at the local and regional level. As we drive forward on the state's ambitious resilient infrastructure agenda that seeks to leverage potentially unprecedented federal funding as well, we need to ensure that governments and community-based organizations at every level have the tools to guarantee these investments reduce risk and build resilience, especially for our most vulnerable communities. This funding will support investment in actionable tools to help better direct resources toward those communities most in need. This includes funding for a new ICARP Vulnerable Communities platform and enhanced visual mapping tools that will be released through CalAdapt. In addition to these tools to really help better planning on the ground, we're also putting money into projects that we already know are demonstrated projects for integrated climate solutions on the ground. And I'm talking about the Transformative Climate Communities Program, or TCC, through the Strategic Growth Council. This budget provides $420 million over 3 years to the California Strategic Growth Council to continue the Transformative Climate Communities Program, making substantial place-based investments in the state's most disadvantaged communities. And what this program does is enables community members themselves to create a vision and work alongside local government and community partners to drive planning and oversee implementation of projects that integrate all the pieces we're talking about throughout this budget: affordable housing, urban green spaces, food access, access to clean energy, active transportation, transit options, workforce training, job opportunities, development without displacement. TCC projects do all of that and show that it's possible on the ground. And this proposed investment will enable, at least 15 more communities to be able to take advantage of these funds and implement community development visions. We're also looking in this budget at other types of support directly to regions, and particularly $25 million over 2 years to the Office of Planning and Research to fund local and regional climate adaptation and resilience grants. As communities across California experience more frequent, prolonged, and severe impacts from climate change, there is simply not enough available funds for long-term climate adaptation and resilience planning. The economic impacts of COVID-19, of course, on local and regional governments just exacerbated that dynamic. These planning grants will directly support local and regional adaptation planning activities that are essential to long-term community resilience and help fill some of the gaps in making that possible. And I do want to say that this is not the only Regions Up investment in this budget. There's actually really important Regions Up investment in other pieces of the budget as well, including direct support to regions to reduce vehicle miles traveled and do land conservation and infill housing strategies, which are also critical to climate resilience, as well as regional supports across the budget for labor and workforce strategies to build up new, more resilient industries. So this is one piece, but I think it's really important to look at it as part of a broader Regions Up strategy across the budget. And finally, when it comes to talking about sort of fundamental pieces that are across the whole budget, I want to note that this budget puts $20 million over 5 years into the Strategic Growth Council's Regional Climate Collaboratives program, which is, of course, the program created by Connie Leva's SB 1072. This is a really important program because what it does is ensures direct support to build capacity, particularly in underserved communities, that's needed to meaningfully participate in the planning and implementation strategies that I just talked about all over the budget. Those strategies around resilience grants, the strategies around implementation of some of these priorities. this allows for direct support to those communities to make sure that they're actually engaging in the process through things, frankly, like childcare at meetings, honoraria to participate, making sure that the community-based organizations are able to really do the work and be at the table. So I think that's critically important. And I hope all of those pieces really demonstrate we're leading with science, we're leading with communities, and everything else you're about to hear really builds on both of those things. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Wade Crowfoot, to talk about some of the really groundbreaking investments in his areas.
Hey, thanks so much, Kate, and thanks all for joining. I want to just take stock of this moment and say, I've spent the last couple of decades in and around state government, and I can say this is easily the largest one-time investment in the environment that Governor Newsom is proposing. And there's an opportunity over the next month for you all and the legislature and the governor to really align around investments that I think are going to have real game-changing effect on the state, on the issues that we care about. And huge thanks. A lot of what we propose to fund has found its way to us as ideas through you, whether you're a local government or a scientist or a conservation group or a land manager. So big thanks there. Let me start on climate resilience. Last January, Governor Newsom, in alignment with the legislature, started talking about major investments in climate resilience. And at that point, we had discussed a $4.5 billion climate resilience bond. Keep in mind that with the May revision, the Newsom administration is now proposing over $11 billion of investment into climate resilience. About a $9 billion increase over the governor's January budget. Kate laid out very nicely a lot of what we're doing is trying to establish a framework where we're building capacity of community organizations, underserved communities, regional networks to improve resilience. And then we're working to fund those priority activities. So I talk about 5 major threats as a result of climate change, or driven by climate change, worsened by climate change. Certainly catastrophic wildfire. With this May revision, we're up to 1.2 something billion dollars of proposed investments in proactive upfront actions to build wildfire resilience. Notable increases in the May revision include $250 million in community hardening and more funding for boots on the ground at CAL FIRE. Huge thanks to the legislature and the governor for agreeing to get over almost half of this out the door already through early action. And on drought and flood resilience, the governor earlier this week outlined a proposal totaling over $5 billion with a lot of transformative elements, including major investments in drinking water and wastewater to continue to address water inequities, diversifying supplies, including major investments in infrastructure like recycling, rehabilitation of existing infrastructure, new first time ever funding in voluntary land repurposing where needed to implement SIGMA, a huge broad portfolio of proposed investments. On heat, on extreme heat, the administration is proposing $350 million of investment, including $200 million into the state's urban greening program, heavily focused on underserved communities that suffer from the heat island effect of increased temperatures in the summer. And then sea level rise, including a major $200 million investment in coastal wetland restoration. This obviously all complements the investments that Kate pointed out as it relates to the 5th climate science assessment and all of the capacity building and regional support. Second, a bucket of historic investment I'll reference regards our energy transition. Thanks to many, leadership of many of you, the state has set world-changing goals to transition our economy and our energy system to carbon-free. And to make progress toward that SB 100 goal as it relates to energy generation, we are proposing over $900 million of investment to deploy renewable and clean energy technologies, including long duration energy storage, major energy efficiency investments in the industrial sector, as well as the food processing sector, advancing 100% carbon-free green hydrogen projects, and of course, doubling down on the historic investment in January on electrifying transportation, which I'll let my colleague Jared Blumenfeld talk about. Huge thanks to the CEC in partnership with the PUC and the CAISO and the Air Resources Board. We're really driving this transition in partnership with the legislature. The third area I'll stress is one I've spent a lot of personal time on with my colleague Angela Barranco, and that is advancing what is easily the largest investment in building equitable outdoor access. We know California is a special place because of our nature. We also know 6 in 10 Californians live in park poor communities. Communities of color are likely to be park poor 3 times more frequently than majority white communities. We have a major inequity challenge in our state as it relates to access to our outdoors and nature. So we're focused on proposing the investment of $1 billion to address this equity gap and strengthen our state park system, including putting $125 million into an existing Prop 68 program, the statewide park development and revitalization fund that gets funds into underserved communities that want to build, acquire, and refurbish parks in those communities. Over $100 million of funding into programming, including an existing outdoor equity grants program, and one-time funding to position our state parks to utilize enrichment dollars that are going into our school systems to really invite far more public elementary school students than they normally are able to in our park system. $14 million in our wonderful Explore the Coast program, and almost $10 million in some really interesting pilots, including piloting an adventure pass for 4th graders and their families to access our state parks across the state. Special thanks to the first partner, Jen Seibel-Newsome, for being such a champion on driving this agenda. And the last bucket I'll highlight is just, kind of bread and butter of our agency, which is environmental stewardship and restoration. $80 million of one-time funding to Department of Fish and Wildlife, what I call a down payment to address a major gap that the department has between its statutory mission and the resources it has. That was revealed through the service-based budgeting process. This funding will actually go to hire staff to build capacity over several years. And then we have upwards of over $750 million focused on proposed investment in wildlife corridor, fish passage, multi-benefit habitat restoration. So I'm really excited about this proposed budget. It's a reflection of the work that we do with all of you and we do across agencies. And I'm really looking forward to sharing our thoughts and all the information that you all need to better understand our proposal as the legislature considers it over the next month. I'll turn it over next to my colleague, Jared Blumenfeld, who of course leads the Cal EPA.
Thanks, Wade. Really appreciate it. And Kate and Matt, whole team. Yeah, as Wade said, and Kate before him, this is kind of the day many of us have been waiting for. And I just wanted to thank each of you. I know those of you in advocacy, in the nonprofit and EJ world, all the way through folks who are looking at how to get their electric vehicles into the market, all the way through folks who are doing home hardening. This hopefully is a really important inflection point moment in time where we get to realize the potential that California has to offer in terms of all these solutions at the grandest scale, all the way through what we're doing very locally. So just from my perspective, where I sit, and I think many of us are, we know that the climate emergency requires us to take big, bold steps. It literally is just too late for half measures. We don't have time for them. And so from my perspective, I think, and when you look at the numbers, today's budget really is a gigantic investment in an equitable, carbon neutral tomorrow. And our funding decisions were guided by 3 core principles. health, equity, and jobs. So when we look through all the different competing things, we wanted to make sure there are real benefits to equity, real benefits to health, and that we could show the job pathway. And I think as Professor Manuel Pastor said, we don't simply want to rebuild after COVID, we want to refashion our economy. We want to think differently. We want to create a more equitable, more inclusive, more just future. We can't just rebuild. So this budget really looks at how we do that. We also wanted to make sure that we, as many of you have highlighted and fought for at the federal level, that we can work in collaboration with our federal partners to make sure that every dollar goes further, whether that's on electrifying school buses or rebuilding drinking water infrastructure. There's a huge, huge opportunity and synergy, and we took advantage of that. This is the largest, single largest environmental budget in our history at $9 billion. And importantly, it really ensures that we rise and raise all boats at the same time to meet the challenges of coming out of the pandemic and the climate emergency that we all face. The climate resiliency package included in today's announcement targets 60% or more of this overall funding in disadvantaged and low-income communities across the state, who are often overwhelmingly communities of color also. We're providing lifeline financial support to California residents through a $1 billion investment to cover unpaid water bills accrued due to COVID-19, providing needed relief to individuals and families across the state in some of our most vulnerable communities. Many of you on the line today helped both pass the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Act, get that done, but also the governor was very early out of the gate saying we want to make sure that communities, especially low-income communities, don't have their water turned off as a result of COVID. We now have $1 billion in the budget to help fill that gap, especially with most at-risk families and systems. We also are expanding Cal EPA's environmental justice grants to help build local capacity and make sure that EJ groups and communities have the ability to help shape the investment in this historic budget. It's not just enough to put the money out there. The implementation is where the details and the devil often rest, and we want to make sure that we are giving you the capacity to help inform that process. So it's actually now $25 million over 2 years. We also put $10 million to the Department of Pesticide Regulation to develop a statewide community notification network to alert residents of hazardous pesticides applications and guard against exposures. We can talk more about that later. And earlier this week, as Wade mentioned, the governor unveiled $5.1 billion in water infrastructure and drought response to, in the context of climate change, really look at our resiliency. That includes $1.3 billion for drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, and $150 million for groundwater cleanup and water recycling to improve our climate resilience, but also to focus on the communities most vulnerable from those impacts. So we're not just focusing on recovering from the pandemic, but we also are working across all that you'll have heard from Kate and Wade, and in a minute from Karen, to guard against future climate disasters and build resiliency to those emergencies. We all lived through last year's wildfires and the orange skies. The governor basically said, we need to leave no stone unturned. We need to accelerate what we're doing in every area. He took some really bold action, including the 2035 ZEV mandate, ending fracking, asking CARB to come up with a phase-out date for oil extraction no later than 2045, and many other measures. And as we talk about the ZEV work, and I know there's some questions already in the chat, and I can get into it either now or later as to the exact breakdown, but the zero emission vehicle package is $3.2 billion over the next fiscal years. I know many of you have been fighting for that. It goes to CARB, CEC, and GoBiz to accelerate our ZEV transition, both in light, medium, and heavy duty transportation sectors. We want to make sure that we, as with everything, had a very strong focus on equity. So we're really doubling down on zero emission transportation options for low income and disadvantaged communities, but also looking at the emissions that most impact air quality, asthma, and all the things that California still has to do to get into attainment of the Clean Air Act. As many of you have seen, the American Lung Association report, 7 of the 10 worst cities in the United States are still Californian cities when it comes to air quality. So there's a lot that we have to do. We're going to invest $800 million for the clean cars and transportation and equity projects. That's $400 million over 3 years for the CVRP, the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, and $400 million over 3 years for the CARB Clean Air, Clean Cars for All and transportation equity programs. We could spend all our time talking about those programs and how that will work, but basically the governor's push and the work that you're all doing means that 9% of all new car sales this last quarter in California were EVs. We need to maintain that momentum, but we also need to make sure that momentum is continued to be focused on equity. CARB has a total of $2 billion in the proposed budget for the next 3 years, which adds, just to give you a context of how much the budget has changed, adds $1.6 billion in new funding to the current $465 million cap and trade funding proposed by the governor in January. That will fund 1,000 zero emission drayage trucks. As many of you who work on port communities and warehouse communities know, those are short haul trucks, often old, nearly always diesel. Getting them and the infrastructure to charge them will be huge. 1,000 zero emission school buses. And as you saw in the president's infrastructure funding proposal, there's also a lot for zero emission school buses there. And then 1,000 zero emission transit buses. All really, we believe, catalytic to moving the state towards our 2045 carbon neutrality goals. And we'll be leading the world as we are. We have 34 electric vehicle manufacturers in the state. Zero emission vehicles are the state's #1 export right now. And we want to build on that in this budget, but not just build on it, really double down on it. So we believe this budget does that. We also have $150 million to help the 2025 phase out of ag burning in the San Joaquin Valley. The CARB board recently passed that. And we want to support farmers in helping make that happen. Moving to DTSC and toxics, communities, it's not all climate change. It's also making sure we have safe, thriving communities, and the governor and the DTST, Jesus, I can't even say Department of Toxic Substances Control today. I'm so excited about all these changes. But the time for the reform is now, this year. We've had a lot of great work with many of you to achieve that. The governor has a comprehensive reform package in the trailer bill. We need to make sure that gets done. And we have $500 million, an addition of 200 from where we started in January, to help in multiple years accelerate the cleanup of contaminated properties and impacted communities. And we're tying it to the reform of DTSC. We're basically saying, yes, we want a board. Yes, we need fee reform. Yes, we need this $500 million, and we need to do it now. So anything that all of you can do to help push this, get this done, we're asking for your help. An example of why we need this is the Exide facility that many of you have worked to clean up. It's an example of what shouldn't happen, and government has had to step in. We're adding to the $31 million that was in the budget, $291 million to further clean up residential properties in the area affected by the facility, and $132 million for all the post-closure cleanup costs that we're having to foot the bill for because the Exide Corporation decided to evade their costs through bankruptcy. That will result in the cleanup of roughly 2,700 additional properties with the highest levels of contamination and risk to communities and the environment. And then there's just so much in this budget that's exciting. In terms of fostering innovation, we're really looking at ways of changing the way we apply pesticides to move towards a less toxic regimen of pest management in the future. And the mill proposal does that. We continue to want to have a tiered system so the most toxic chemicals that are applied have the highest mill fee. And the majority of that money would go in partnership with Karen, Secretary Ross at CDFA, to integrated pest management to really help farmers make that transition. And then finally, we have really an area that's very close to the governor's heart, which is recycling in a circular economy. And the May revision proposes $130 million to support the development of infrastructure to process recyclables, to do that in state. I think our goal is pretty clear that if you sell something in California, it should be recyclable in California. Recycling can create, if we really, really push to where we need to go and aren't exporting our materials, about 100,000 new jobs in the state. And we've heard also loud and clear that 1383, the short-lived climate pollutant bill that goes into effect, really needs funding. So we have 55 million in grants for new composting and organic waste, 15 million in grants, and 50 million for low interest loans to attract recycling and reuse business in California. So we're putting our money behind making this really work in California. And finally, really, if you think about the different ingredients, we've got all the policy smarts, we've got all the technical smarts. Luckily in California, we've got with the governor, the political willingness to take risk. What often we didn't have was funding. So funding will help accelerate both our ambition and our implementation of actions needed to achieve climate justice. And I just want to end by where I started, which is to thank each and every one of you for the work you've done to both push the policy, push us to think bold, and hopefully that boldness is mirrored and you see it in all the different elements of the budget you're hearing about today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Karen Ross, who is the Secretary for CDFA and really is a leader in thinking about how we can move an incredibly important part of our economy and our workforce to be a critical champion for climate solutions. Karen, over to you.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks, everyone. It's a good day. It's a happy day, and it's a great way to end the week this Friday. And I just want to take a few moments to touch on what has been proposed in this comeback plan for agriculture and our healthy food systems. And I really want to first start off by just expressing my appreciation to Governor Newsom and the First Partner for their vision about the sustainability of agriculture, the importance of agriculture, and really incorporating that through making sure that every California citizen has access to healthy California grown food, that when we focus on nutrition, we can age in a more healthy way through every decade of our life. So this is a reflection of not only what we can do to invest in agriculture and its long-term sustainability and resilience, but agriculture as part of the solution by practices and those answers that are on our natural working lands, our land management practices, to really not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, but more importantly, to be part of the solution by drawing down carbon and storing it. And that's an important part of what we're seeking going forward. We have three distinct categories that I'm going to talk about today. And the first one is the foundation for healthy food production, and that is climate smart agriculture for sustainability and resilience. The total increase that's proposed for the CDFA budget in this comeback plan is another $641 million, and it's allocated across these three categories. Jared has already mentioned the transition from ag burning and the proposed investment of $150 million for the San Joaquin Air District, because it is under the attainment It's not under attainment, it's trying to achieve attainment. Sorry for that. But also, Jared may have mentioned, and I didn't catch it, that the budget, the comeback plan also proposes an additional $193 million for the farmer program. That would be over a 2-year period of time, what was in the January budget and in this comeback plan, to really accelerate the replacement of older equipment and engines to improve our air quality and to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The proposal includes an additional $70 million for our Healthy Soils program. It's one of our fastest growing new programs. It proposes $60 million for livestock methane emission reductions, that short-lived climate pollutant that was part of 1383. And it has, the dairy sector has really stepped into this space and made remarkable progress in reducing methane emissions from the livestock sector. There's a proposal of $30 million for pollinator habitat. This will be a 2-pronged program. One will be around incentives for individual landowners to do things like hedgerows or cover crop, really providing that habitat and that forage for our native pollinators, as well as those that we bring in from other states, but also really trying to connect on a broader landscapes approach, bringing multiple landowners together to create the nutrition and the habitat for all of our pollinator species. This is an important element of our goals on biodiversity, and I'm excited to get this program started with the newly established California Pollinator Coalition that was just announced last week. There's $20 million that's proposed for on-farm conservation planning management. This is in partnership with our colleagues at the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, which also provides some funding to do whole farm conservation planning. It could be a funding for those who want to transition into organic farming to be able to cost share in that planning, and also for carbon farm plans, which is another way for farmers to be able to step into being part of the solution to climate change. And then a new program, it's a pilot program that's being proposed, and that is a California grown sustainable cannabis program. We need to collect the data to benchmark the practices in that particular sector of our outdoor growers in these legacy areas, and capture that for best management practices and position them to participate in state and federal voluntary programs in the future. The one other thing I want to add, it was announced earlier this week in the drought and water resilience package that was announced on Monday, that included an additional $60 million for our on-farm water use efficiency program, SWEEP, $5 million for on-farm technical assistance, especially targeting our small farms to improve their water use efficiency, and $1.5 million for doing the work to quantify the economic impact of drought and to take all the mapping and the new tools that are being developed and being able to improve the preciseness of drought management decision-making tools for farmers. In the healthy, resilient, and equitable food systems category here, Farm to School program, we just launched that program a year ago with the championship of Jennifer Siebel-Newsome. It has been widely embraced by our school nutrition directors and local growers to really bring a partnership together to improve the availability of locally grown, nutritious, climate smart food in the school feeding programs, local procurement. This is a way of improving the health and nutrition of our students, as well as really important markets for our small and mid-sized growers in a local region. And we've already just last month announced the first round of funding from last year's appropriation and look forward to this additional funding for the Farm to School program. There is $12 million for urban farming. Those will be in the form of grants to the many startup urban farms, large-scale community gardening. And this is particularly important into many underserved areas where there are food deserts. And many of our newcomers and our immigrant community are very focused on agriculture and being able to grow their own food, and it's culturally appropriate for those families. So we're excited to get that program going. There's $15 million that's been proposed for the California Nutrition Incentive Program, which allows our low-income population using their CalFresh coupons, WIC coupons, to redeem them for fresh produce, locally grown produce, tree nuts, and other California agricultural products. We also have for infrastructure to be able to use more fresh produce, to equip corner stores, our food banks, which become a very important outlet to improve nutrition to those that have found themselves all of a sudden food insecure with the pandemic, $20 million for refrigeration grants, and then $500,000 to expand our senior farmers market nutrition program. So that's that for our food systems. And then in the category of economic recovery and high road job growth, $30 million is being proposed for the Fresno Merced Future of Food Innovation Initiative. This is a result of extensive stakeholder process led by the Community Foundation in the Central Valley to envision a future that builds on our agricultural expertise, but allows it to diversify by taking a look at the inputs, the outputs, doing more processing locally, doing custom manufacturing for automation, adopting technology that's the appropriate scale for the many small farmers as well as larger farmers, and really creating that hub with a UC Merced CSU Fresno partnership. It also includes UC Ag and Natural Resources, and create better jobs in the Valley by becoming a world-renowned hub for sustainable agriculture. There's a $10 million proposal for new and beginning farmer training, as well as farm manager and apprenticeship program, technical assistance for underserved farmers with early action adopted by the legislature. We're proposing an additional $2 million in this comeback plan to really support our small farmers and ensure that in a time of great consolidation, we can keep small farmers on the landscape. And the final addition is for the department to have a rural economic advisor as we work in all of our rural regions that are dominated by agriculture to really improve their resiliency by diversifying their economy and keeping small farms in business. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea, I think, on any comments to close us out on the Q&A section. Thank you. Oh, I'm so sorry, Andrea, I forgot. $150 million for fairgrounds and community resilience planning and development of other types of facilities to better equip our local communities to have robust and appropriate scaled emergency response centers, as well as the services to be able to improve resiliency in our local communities. That's $150 million. That will also be a grant program developed in coordination with OPR, OES, and CAL FIRE. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Ross. We'll now turn it over to our question and answer portion. On the bottom of your screens, you'll see a Q&A box. You can type in your question there and we'll try to get to it in the many various orders that we have here. Initially, I'm going to turn it over to Director Kate Gordon and Secretary Wade Crowfoot.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm trying to figure out the best way to moderate this, given that there are so many questions already. But I think that we've been dismissing the ones that have been answered on the fly. So let me, I don't know, Wade, if you have a good way to do this, let me, there's a lot of questions in here about the forest health program. So I think I'm going to start with those and maybe ask for some more detail into the wildfire and forest management program, and maybe just detailing out sort of how much of that's about forest management, how much of it's about hardening, how much of it is for kind of longer term resilience. Can you just detail out a little more on that one? And maybe that's you, Wade, and or I know that I think that Chief Porter might be on as well. So can you take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I would broadly say that the governor proposed a historic investment in upfront proactive actions on the wildfire resilience side in his January budget. We all know that between the legislature and the governor, they've built a response capacity over the last couple of years, expanding, CAL FIRE's capacity by over 700 million. this year, as we continue to strengthen response, we're focused on really a paradigm shift toward pairing response, obviously, with a bunch of upfront actions and investments, and some paradigm shift there, including really focused on elevating regional leadership and focusing on wildfire resilience region by region and getting resources to those regions, introducing far more prescribed fire onto landscapes than we've had in the past, and really focusing in investments on 3 concentric circles: within communities, home hardening, defensible space, planning; around communities, particularly emergency fuel breaks; and then across landscapes, certainly forest management, ecologically based forest management, but landscape management generally, whether it's oak woodlands or chaparral. There was such a significant investment in the January budget. There is an increase in investment from a little over $1 billion to about $1.25 billion in this as a result of the May revise, with a focus on infrastructure hardening in communities, $250 million, almost $40 million of additional boots on the ground for CAL FIRE, and then funding much of our technology and aerial assets, making sure they can roll out as quickly as possible. So really, that's been the focus, Kate.
Thanks so much. And I actually saw a question further down that I'll speak to really quickly, which is a question about how we're sort of managing fuels, like the multiple benefits from taking waste wood coming out of the forest through all the strategies Wade just mentioned, and thinking about things like economic development and market development around that. If you look at actually the early action budget, there are a set of pilot projects and an X Prize specifically dedicated to thinking about strategies to get both forest and agricultural wood waste really into more productive uses, and looking at all kinds of interesting advanced wood products sector potential there. So that is something that the governor's definitely focused on, as well as additional funds in this budget proposal for the Catalyst Fund to really drive toward innovative and commercialized strategies to do advanced wood products. I'm going to.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
and
please.
And Matt or Andrea, we're getting some questions around where can people find the best breakdown of all of these proposed investments. It's obviously a lot for people to take in just verbally. Where's the best source for that? Let me turn to Matt or somebody from the Department of Finance.
Hi, I'm sorry, I got sidetracked on another question. Can you repeat the question?
Where is the best place that somebody can actually find on the internet that shows the summary of all of these investments on paper?
Yeah, so those would be what's considered, we call them the Department of Finance A pages. And if you go under our website, under the budget, there will be a link to the May revision budget summary. And if you
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
And Andrea, can you type that? Can you add that link to the answered questions in the Q&A so people can have it on their computers?
Yeah, she's doing that now. Thank you.
Great.
For doing that. Go ahead. Wade, did you have another one you
want
to
just a couple of quick ones. Sonia asks, Jared, can you please repeat how much is allocated for EJ groups to help shape process and implementation? Was it 25 million over 2 years?
Yep, 25 billion over 2 years. And that's up from 1.5 million or 3 million over 2 years. So it's pretty significant, and really want folks to help shape how we think about that solicitation too. So look forward to having. There was another question about ZEV, Wade, which I'm just going to quickly share the screen. Hopefully people can see that. This is a great breakdown that Carb did of all the different funding, so people can kind of see where it is and where it's going. And you can see we bundled some of this together. So the drayage trucks also goes with the infrastructure. And this is multiple year funding. This is just for this fiscal year, because that was the main question that we were getting asked. Okay, so if it's over 3 years, what's actually happening this year? So significant increases in some of these categories. There actually was no money available in the last budget in many of these categories. So really focusing on doubling down on things, for instance, like the ZEV manufacturing grants, 125 million. This is work that GoBiz is doing, for instance, the ZEV market development strategy. And really, when you look at that investment of CVRP and Clean Cars for All and equity, significant, and then transit and school buses, 250 million, and then the drayage. So this is the basic breakdown. You'll see different breakdowns in the A pages because it goes by year and by category, but just wanted to afford people the opportunity to see that, and I will turn it back to questions.
Thanks. There's one I want to lift up, which is from Michelle at TNC, which is the question that's a really good one of how all of this is going to relate to the upcoming scoping plan process. And I think Leanne Randolph is on, and I'm hoping she can answer.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, all of these great investments will be, we can take into consideration as we're thinking about the different strategies that we're deploying in terms of all of our greenhouse gas reduction strategies. So this will all become part of our analysis in our modeling, assuming, of course, it's passed by the legislature.
Thanks, Leanne. There's a number of questions I'm going to combine into one and ask for answers. Maybe this is sort of anybody, but I think Jared, and then I think that Jesse Buendia from SDC is on too and may want to jump in on this one, which is really this question about how are we providing direct support to disadvantaged communities or underserved communities to take advantage of these programs? What kinds of direct support are we giving to make sure? And this also goes in another question, Karen, to disadvantaged farmers or to farmers who are from underserved communities. How are we really lifting up those communities in this funding? I'm going to ask maybe Jessie first, since she's doing a lot of this work, and then I'll go back to others who want to answer it.
Great, thank you guys so much. So we are really excited.
Oh, Jessie, we can't hear you for some reason.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
You're very quiet,
Super
Jessica.
quiet.
Can you start with Jared and I'll fix my audio and come back?
Sure, I'll start with Jared and Karen, and then we'll come back to you. Jared, did you want to jump on this one particularly with the EPA, Cal EPA, EJ grants?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Kate?
It's really how are we making sure that disadvantaged communities or underserved communities are able to access these funds and connect to these programs?
Yeah, so that was really the genesis in talking with the governor's office and the whole team that you have in front of you. We wanted to make sure, especially because this part in the future hopefully will grow with a federal infrastructure infusion of funds, but even just this is historic amount of funding. And often when we talk to communities that are wanting to engage in these processes, it's often the barrier to entry is pretty high, and it takes time and energy and effort. So we wanted to make sure that with everything that the state is doing across the broad swath of funding, not just in the discussion today, that there's a capacity of EJ communities to participate. And so that's why we actually front load the funding. So it will be 15 million in this fiscal year and then 10 million in the following, because we believe this is the year where there's going to have to be a lot of engagement. We want you to engage. We need you to engage to make these processes work. And we want to make sure that you have the funding to do that. So the goal is to get this out onto the street soon. As many of you may know, it's relatively small amounts of money that go a long way for many groups. The size of the grant traditionally has been about $50,000. And our goal is to get that out soon so that everything from home hardening to where we should get the drayage trucks converted first, all the way through the work that Karen's doing on Sigma. How do we make sure that groups that often have not been at the table are at the table? That's what the funding is for, and really look forward to having a follow-up discussion with many of you about the best way to write and describe that solicitation so it meets the needs that you have.
And maybe Kieran, since you're, I'm not sure if Jesse's able to talk, Kieran. Oh, sorry, Karen and Kieran.
I think I'm good, but yes.
Oh, good. Jesse and then Karen. Sorry, there's many people on with similar names. Go ahead, Jesse, and then Karen, and then we'll move on.
Oh, thank you, Secretary Ross. Yes, no, I'll just mention many of you on the call advocated through the Senate, through Senator Connie Leyva for the Regional Climate Collaboratives work, which is built off of SGC's technical assistance and capacity building efforts. And so we are really excited for $20 million over the course of 2 years to go out the door to actually support groups coming together to participate in major planning processes like the ones that Kate named earlier, specifically related to climate adaptation, but also just transition and a number of other efforts. And so you will see on the ground an infusion again of technical assistance and capacity building work that's unprecedented, and we're very, very excited about that. And then people are aware about our Transformative Climate Communities program, which has always had as a cornerstone of that programmatic work, technical assistance, as well as stakeholder oversight over the entire project scope. And so those are $30 million grants that are going deep in one place in an integrated way. And so I think you'll see a combination of those two things and what Karen and Jared said, as well as some of the efforts at OPR, as just a huge commitment from the governor to making sure that we're leveling the playing field and that we're getting communities who've been left out of these processes to be at the center of them.
And very quickly, Kate, I can speak specifically to historically underserved farmers and disadvantaged communities. This began 3 years ago with an Act for Farmer Equity advisor at the Department of Food and Agriculture, and our first ever farmer equity report that was released in January of 2021. Since then, we've established 2 advisory committees, one for small farms and one for historically underserved farmers, and many of those farmers are farmers of color. We stood up the very first ever technical assistance program to support these farmers in being able to access coronavirus relief programs, many of them because of the complications or lack of broadband. Yay, $7 billion for broadband in the governor's proposal today. To really provide them the hands-on expertise to be able to apply for relief programs where they are available, and then to work with them on doing all of that paperwork. That was part of early action. It squeezed into the wildfire early action that passed about a month ago. We already had a program ready to stand up, and we will probably announce next week that first round of grants with that. So this additional $5.7 million will extend our work to make sure we're reaching those farmers in every one of the communities up and down the state of California. So that's where it's new for us, but we're embedding the importance of equity and the historically underserved farmers throughout all of our programs in CDFA. It's part of our racial equity work at CDFA. Thank you.
Thanks.
Kate, one
Wade.
important investment I forgot to mention regards offshore wind. And Nancy asked a question about offshore wind and the governor's proposal about the $20 million on offshore wind. So we'll turn it to David Hochschild, who leads the CEC and has been doing great work with Karen Douglas on this.
Yeah, thanks, Wade. I would just add we're really excited about the benefits offshore wind can bring to California. We have an 800-mile coastline, obviously, and the technology has improved hugely over the last few years. Just 4 years ago, the largest turbine for floating offshore wind was 7 megawatts, and now it's a 14 megawatt turbine, and the wind resource is better than wind on land, and actually is sort of the perfect yin yang fit with solar. So it's actually ramping up in the morning, going down in the middle of the day, and up in the afternoon and evening, which really complements our solar generation. Will help us move beyond natural gas faster. So we've been having some really fruitful discussions with the Biden administration and are on a good path. We hope to have a more news to share on that shortly.
Thanks so much, David. That actually is a good tee off. There's a number of questions in here that are about sort of job training, workforce. How do we make sure people are trained for the industries we're talking about? And one of the things about this budget is I think we've all said, it really is a whole of government and sort of an integrated approach. And many of those pieces you'll find in other parts of the budget when you look at those A pages that you got the link for. Please do also look in the labor and workforce development section, because there you'll find a first of its kind community economic resilience fund at $750 million to directly support regions in putting together strategies that will help them design or invest in industries and workforce strategies that are part of our carbon neutral future. It really is our down payment on ensuring every region can have a transition strategy that really works toward this climate future we're all talking about. And that includes direct connections to a very expanded high road training partnership program through the labor agency that actually connects growth industries like offshore wind to labor and to workers, and to ensure that the jobs created are high quality jobs, that they're jobs available for local communities, and that there's direct pathways into those jobs. So you'll see a really direct connection between the carbon neutral future we're all talking about here and the way that we make sure that the jobs are high quality, that there are pathways into those jobs, and that there isn't a one size fits all. There is no one size fits all answer for every region of the state of what those jobs look like. So I encourage you to look over there. One other quick thing to look at in other parts of the budget, because someone asked directly about this, is in the housing budget, you'll actually see $500 million for regional plans to essentially help reduce vehicle miles traveled, which, as you know, is the other side of the coin of electrifying transportation in terms of bringing down our transportation emissions. And there's a direct support for regions, 500 million for regions to do VMT reduction strategies, including infill housing and land conservation. So all of these are really, in my mind, part of our climate agenda. They're just found in different parts of the budget. So I wanted to throw those to you. There are so many questions here. Wade, others that you want to make sure we answer.
Yeah, let me jump in on a few categories of questions. One is on the proposal regarding the urban greening efforts, specifically $200 million into the Natural Resources Agency's urban greening grant program. That's a grant program in the past that has been funded by bonds as well as cap and trade funding. And it specifically provides resources targeted towards underserved communities to improve communities through tree planting, acquisition of park space, pocket park space. Their most recent round of urban greening grants, actually of $30 million, was directed 100% to disadvantaged communities. $200 million is, as I understand it, by far the largest amount of funding in that program in the state's history. There are questions also about parks access. How are we going to help actually folks get into parks that don't have access right now? One is through providing one-time funding to the Outdoor Equity Grants Program, which allows communities and community-based organizations to apply for funding to be able to build the programming to get folks into kids and others into parks. We're also working with the state parks and Armando Quintero, its director, to develop, strengthen the link between state parks and public school districts to enable school, essentially ready-made field trips of school districts into state parks. Our school system in this proposed budget is getting significant funding for ongoing enrichment activities. And we really want to enable state parks to very, easily host public school districts and make it easy for classes to come into state parks. And then, as I mentioned, we would be increasing or adding $125 million into an existing Prop 68 program called the Statewide Park Development and Community Revitalization Program, which specifically provides grants to local communities, particularly park poor communities, to acquire lands for parks in the community, as well as refurbish existing lands or refurbish existing parks. There have been some questions around really how are we strengthening our partnerships with tribal governments and tribal communities through this budget proposal. I think we're focused across agencies on figuring out ways to leverage these resources to provide funding to tribes to engage in this environmental stewardship and these other activities. I'm really excited with in essence, a pilot proposal that we've made this year for wildfire resilience programs, and specifically a set aside of $20 million. That would be a in essence, a government-to-government transfer from state government to tribal governments to reduce the bureaucracy and really ensure that that funding is reserved for tribes. I think we recognize that the partnerships with tribes are essential, and we need to do a better job at state government providing accessibility of these funds to tribes. So that's a work in progress, but very interested in tribal engagement to ensure these dollars actually can be utilized by tribes. Kate, I think Hari has a really important question, just asking how do disadvantaged communities that may have good ideas but don't have experience accessing state funding, where do they even begin trying to access this funding for clean energy, green transportation, local ecosystem stuff? How would that's a tough question because our programs our grants are across our agencies, but it's a fair question to ask.
One of the things that's actually in the, again, I'm sending you to a different part of the budget, I'm sorry, but that's in the Community Economic Resilience Fund portion of the budget at Labor and Workforce, is that there's planning grants for every region of the state that actually include support for a year of a person to basically connect these regional processes to the state. So actually an ombuds person basically to connect regions to all of the things available for funding for the things that the region decides are a priority. That's not a full answer, but it's part of an answer. I think one of the things we're constantly struggling with at the state, and we talk about this all the time across all those on this call, is how do we better coordinate on our side so that it's easier on your side? And it's challenging because the grant programs have different timeframes and different requirements and different criteria, and it can be challenging. But one thing we are trying to do is, again, through these systems approaches, really create some of the capacity to basically do that connection, which I think will help a lot. So that's one piece of the answer, Wade. Others may want to weigh in on that as well. And
yeah, that's good. I mean, I think that's a good question for us to continue to answer, and whether it's ultimately like a one-stop shop to work with communities that haven't availed themselves of state resources. I think it's just it's a really good observation or question to ask.
It is, and it's related to one that keeps coming up too, which is, I think, a really good question about sort of, and maybe I'll turn to Kieran, who runs our RCC program at Strategic Growth Council to answer this. A question that just basically says, look, so many community-based environmental justice and community-based groups are barely scraping by. Is this funding going to make a difference? How is it going to help? What have you seen really work? So Kieran, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this question is really getting at the heart of, capacity building in communities, and how capacity building is such a critical element for communities, especially in under-resourced parts of the state, to be able to access this critical funding that we call transformative in nature. And so we're really excited to see $20 million allocated to the Regional Climate Collaboratives program in this budget. That would ultimately invest in the underlying capacity, the social networks in communities, particularly with community-based organizations, to engage more deeply and meaningfully in these climate planning processes, as well as other processes coming down the pike, just transition and others.
Thanks, Kieran. Appreciate that. Jared, are you still on? I don't know if you are. I know you had
absolutely. No, I'm still here.
Possibly harder stop. Couple questions about the water money and safe drinking water and clean drinking water. Is that now?
Since inception. So this has been hundreds of billions of dollars. We have untapped needs within the SRF. I think at the last count was about $12 billion or more. And what we're seeing from communities around the state is two things. One, small systems for a whole set of reasons aren't working. They don't have the rate base. They don't have the ability to really invest in the future. And so we're seeing consolidation being a major factor in how we resolve some of these small system failures, whether that's financial or technical. And this can help those larger systems incorporate smaller systems. What it could do in terms of natural solutions, I think is limited, and this is more a kind of hard infrastructure solution. But there's certainly things that are being done in disadvantaged communities, for instance, in the San Joaquin and Imperial Valley, where they're doing point of use devices, point of entry devices into homes rather than building out large amounts of infrastructure. This also, if you look in the LA basin and the city and county of LA has some very ambitious goals around making their water supply local in order to help with climate resiliency. Water recycling projects are oversubscribed time and time again, as are large projects to deal with things, which is included in this budget. We have $20 million to deal with PFAS in particular. So the most amount of money will go to systems that need infrastructure upgrades, while we spend a lot of time talking about drinking water. There's a huge unmet need as it relates to wastewater as well. Many communities, if you go up to Lake County, for instance, around Clear Lake, are still on septic. Those systems are having large impacts on that water body, as is true around the state. So in answer to the question, we'd love to think about ways of working with the federal government to have some more latitude around the types of projects like low impact development and other ways of treating water that aren't hard infrastructure. And we look forward to having that conversation.
Thanks so much, Jared. A couple things. I wanted to say that in the chat, Andrea has posted the California Grants Portal website, which we should have mentioned. It's really helpful in finding state grants. That's fairly new, I think, in the last year. And so that's a really helpful website as a way into seeing all the grants that are available. And then Karen Ross, Secretary Ross, I know you wanted to answer one of these questions live, so I'm going to turn to you to do that. And that's really about panels that CDFA puts together to consider proposals.
Yes, and I think the comment was one that how can we broaden and increase the diversity of folks who are reviewing our panels? And that's one of the reasons why we've now created a couple of advisory task forces for us to really think about how do we recruit and make sure that we've got diversity and inclusiveness from all the sets of eyes that take a look at proposals and put those through. So it's part of our commitment. I will confess we are still fairly new in this, and having funding to community-based organizations providing technical assistance to farmers is something we hope to build up and down the state of California. But I will also note that the University of California Ag and Natural Resources, they have several small farm advisors that provide a lot of technical assistance, and they find themselves doing more of that kind of work to help farmers know what's available at USDA, what might be available at GoBiz, what does CDFA have, and then help them apply for those proposals, as we try to also take some of our specialty crop block grant money and invest that in capacity building to improve the grant writing capacity of organizations that historically have not been able to access some of those programs. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Secretary. Wade, are there any in here that you want to make sure you highlight?
Yeah, I just want to make a general point because, there's a whole lot of people on the phone, some of who understand the budget process really well, many of us that may not. So just so you understand, everything that we're talking about today is simply a proposal at this point. The governor proposes the budget starting in January. This is called the May revision, which is typically an adjustment of a budget based on revenues. Well, as a result of the strong California comeback and federal revenues, there's a lot of one-time money. So folks are asking, how do I access this money? What are you planning on it? We have to make very clear that this is just the governor's proposal to the legislature, and the legislature is considering this over the coming few weeks. So I would just say that if you're somebody who cares about these items, track the discussion in the legislature and feel free, to make your voice heard. I will say there were a lot of questions about, is there funding for our 30 by 30 target to conserve 30% of California by 2030? And I would answer by saying yes, but it's spread across different programs, including our parks acquisition, our wildlife habitat restoration, which can include acquisition. A lot of money, for example, will come through the Wildlife Conservation Board. That is absolutely central to our 30 by 30 goal. I think about the 30 by 30 goal as a little bit like akin to the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or the RPS goal, that jump-started our effort to make our grid renewable by suggesting that we had a target. We didn't create a new department or a new program called the RPS program, but we made investments to achieve the RPS. And that's really what we're focused on with 30 by 30, even as we, develop the strategy to spend, years achieving it. So thanks for those questions and look forward to unpacking that more.
Great questions. I'm going to do a time check. We have about 10 minutes left. There's so many people and so many great questions, and I really appreciate Wade making that clarification. And the other clarification, because it's semi-related to a question in here, is just that that the money that we're talking about is this is a one-time spending, even though some of these categories are spent out over a few years. And Department of Finance has done an amazing job at figuring out how to sort of have the spending be in tranches out over years so that it's a little more consistent. But we're not talking about continuous appropriations here. We're talking about one-time spending and really trying to be thoughtful to what will make the most difference with that kind of spending. And I don't know if Matt's still on. I cannot see who's still on.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kate. Folks are a little confused by when we say, over 2 years. What does that mean?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So in our 8 pages that we alluded to earlier, we spelled out in detail the amount that we're proposing for next year, but and you can kind of see the details there, but we do a multi-year forecast, and sense is a multi-year commitment in water projects, in climate resilience, in clean vehicle rebates that will actually span multiple years. So you'll see in there some parentheticals that even though we might be proposing a certain amount for transformative climate communities, for example, in the budget year, we're also in our multi-year proposing that we additional money in the out years as well. Again, this wouldn't be ongoing, but it would be, say, 2-year funding or 3-year funding, as the case may be. So thank you for that clarification, and hope that makes sense.
Thank you. I've been doing this now for 2.5 years, and I get confused by this, so I'm not surprised that others do. Wade, you answered the question you wanted to answer, I think.
Yeah, there's a couple more just as you're looking through more of
these.
Go ahead. What do we mean by, what do we mean by hardening infrastructure as it relates to wildfires? Really, through that, we mean protecting infrastructure. So home hardening, for example, includes making changes to your home to make it more fire resistant. And that can be everything from big things like changing the roofing material to very small, affordable things like putting screens on top of your chimney so embers don't come in. We also talk about community hardening or infrastructure hardening. That could involve, for example, widening roads to allow for access and egress in the case of an emergency wildfire, or protecting sort of key infrastructure, assets in a community. I'll note that this May revision of the budget calls for an additional $250 million in a community hardening program that will be managed by our Office of Emergency Services. And they do a great job, really, both leveraging federal funding for this and helping communities prepare for disasters like wildfires. We also have a pilot program for home hardening, the state putting in a portion, the feds putting in a portion. We hope it's a $100 million pilot program for home hardening, really working to identify what's the role for state funding as homeowners improve their own homes. And that pilot program is being developed in a joint powers agreement or joint powers authority between Cal Fire and OES. And it will likely have at least 2 locations, one in Northern California, one in Southern California.
And Wade, just a related question. Somebody asked if home hardening also, if there's ability for like small business or nonprofits also, or is it just residential homes? What's the reach of that program?
Now, that's a good question. And I think the program criteria or the eligibility criteria is still being developed. So I think that's a good, I'll take it as a point of input that there's an interest of, identifying potentially community serving non-residential buildings for building hardening.
Perfect. And then a question, I think if Nuantara, you're still on, just a question generally about budget for research and development in mitigation and adaptation. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the fifth climate assessment and the approach there, and sort of how that's going to provide some of the research and science for some of these other things we're talking about.
Yes, very happy to. I'm always happy to talk about the assessment. So the funding in this budget proposal includes 22 million funding to support implementation of the 5th California Climate Change Assessment. We're really looking to build off of the successes of the 4 previous assessments and really driving towards investment in state research that can help action on the ground, both in terms of driving towards our carbon neutrality, but also building resilience and supporting adaptation actions. So through the funding proposal for the implementing the 5th assessment, which was codified through Senate Bill 1320 last year, we're really looking to achieve a few different objectives. One is ensuring that there's a really engaged process through the 5 years of the assessment process itself, making sure that the research questions that we are investing in are actually meeting on the ground community need, and that communities are partnering in developing the research solutions as well. We're also looking at, as we did in the last assessment, but building out and enhancing this, actually then translating the science and the research to regional contexts, into local contexts, because we know that communities on the ground also need that translation support, taking the complex research and making it actionable. And then one of the important pieces that we're really interested in through the assessment is, and excited about, is the proposal to establish a tribal specific grant program, really recognizing the importance of directly funding tribes to do research directly, but then also supporting more capacity to be able to bring tribal knowledge into our broader ecosystem of climate science and research as well. So those are a few ways through the assessment. We're really looking to try to bridge together many of the things that have been talked about here today.
Thanks so much, Tara. And we're wrapping in a minute, but I think someone asked, and it's really the perfect question to end on, because as Wade said, this is a proposal. There is a process through the legislature, of course, and working with all of you to make it a reality. And someone asks, what can we do to support this and help move it through? That's a great question. And we certainly need your help. So I mean, I will let Karen. Karen's doing vociferous nodding, so I'm going to have her start off. Karen, you're on mute.
Sorry,
Karen.
I know I got so excited, but we all need champions and advocates. And I would say support everything, please. It all is a very integrated package. And it is this once in a generation opportunity to invest and be equipped for the future. And so I would just welcome as many champions, cheerleaders, advocates, whatever you want to call yourself, educators, to reach out in the legislative setting and to tell your friends about the really good work that Governor Newsom has proposed for us. It matters for every Californian. That's what makes it so meaningful.
Totally agreed, Karen. And I would just say, I mean, our legislature are huge champions of so much that we've talked about here today. And in many cases, challenge us to invest even more. So, you know, we hope there'll be a really good constructive conversation, and expect there will be one on all of these topics. But, you know, it's an important time to actually make your voice heard. And so this is really the opportunity. As I understand it, the legislature has to approve a budget by June 15th. So this is a tremendous amount of work that they have in front of them. And there'll be opportunities for public comment, so you can share your perspective here as early as next week.
Perfect. Technically, they can go past the 15th, but if they do, they don't get paid. And so ever since that rule got put in place, they tend to get it done on the 15th, which is a good incentive. I'll just say, just piggybacking on what Wade said, so many of the things that we laid out here are the result, you know, even though the budget process feels like a kind of a fire drill sometimes, they're the result of years of work with all of you and also with a lot of our legislative partners. You'll see bills that are occurring through the session right now that are very, very complementary to what the governor has proposed, and that's not an accident. So we really hope to find great areas of collaboration and move forward on things that we've all been working on together for a really long time. So this is just getting that ball up the hill, getting that boulder pushed up the hill and getting it over the top. And we really do need your help and your collaboration in doing that. Jared, if you're still on, any final words that you want to say before we wrap?
Just thank you to everyone. I know the commitment, none of us are here in a vacuum. We're here as part of a community, and you're a critical part of that. And just thank you for the great ideas. Thank you for the tireless advocacy that has led to many of these things. We've talked about them, and now they're going to become a reality if this budget passes. And I think it's a testament to California's leadership in this space, to your innovative thinking, and to the governor's willingness to say, yeah, we got to go bold, we got to go big, we got to do it now. And we look forward to the fun, but sometimes challenging next part, which is implementing this really big, bold agenda. So thanks to everyone, and mainly thanks to all the colleagues within government that are working tirelessly. You know, it feels like we go from one thing to the next, and just want to thank everyone for participating.
Perfect. Well, Andrea, any final words, or can we? I'm hearing none. Thank you. And Andrea's put some great stuff in the chat in terms of how to find the plan, how to find access to our grant website, the initial the detail on DOF's website about all these things. So join us in our budget sprint now through June 15th. We really love working with all of you, and thank you, my colleagues, and everyone who put this call together behind the scenes.